Okay, this is a trial recording. We're going to choose a tool and highlight things and so forth. Hi everyone, I'm doing a sample. Hi everyone, this is a new format that I'm trying, a Camtasia video, to see if we can get closed captions more readily. So this is Module 5. This video is going to cover a little bit of advice on your signature assignment, and then we're going to dig into measures and how to use them to support educational change, and of course also in your assignment. This video is going to be in 2 parts, so this is part 1. So a little advice on your assignment. Number 1, I recommend revising the fishbone based on your listening session before selecting the drivers of interest, because your listening session, as you all talked about, is so important in understanding the full picture of what is it that creates the challenge that you're talking about. So revise the fishbone, add in the pieces that came out in your listening session, then say, okay, here's the 2 or 3 drivers that I'm going to focus on in part 3. And then, of course, you'll want to be very specific about those in part 3, but you don't need to introduce the solution until part 4, right? So part 3, you're just identifying, here's the 3 drivers that I find to be both important and actionable. And then finally, just kind of back to that causality issue. In your diagram of your drivers and in your logic model, you can ask yourself, does this lead to that? So as you put in your arrows, really ask, does this piece lead to that piece? To kind of make sure that the causality is going in the right direction. I also want to thank you for your feedback to me in the sheets of paper that I collected last in-person session. There was a lot of positive things, which I so appreciate because, you know, as teachers, we all do. But I also wanted to note there was a request for more time to meet individually and more time on the readings in the in-person classes. So definitely the second one, I will try to meet our final in-person class, Module 6. More time to meet individually. I'm not sure we'll have that during Module 6. In fact, I'm pretty sure we won't, but I am very happy to arrange individual meetings. Please just write me an email. We'll meet over Zoom or we can meet in person. Other thoughts on part 3, just fantastic job. I've really been enjoying reading your part 3. You will all receive individual feedback, and I might also send a class email with just some basic advice. One final point, if you're struggling at all with part 3, is use the example of the Hayes Action Research Plan to kind of see how I did it. And final piece of advice, part 4, you do need to do a logic model figure like the one that I'm doing here. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be exactly like that. I think, you know, you should definitely be creative and use your own way of thinking about it. You can use some of the stuff in the readings, but you do need a figure. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about measures. This table is in Randolph and Aronin. All right, and this table is one of the ways we're going to talk about measures in our assignment. So the idea is this that you would have this objective, right? You would have the objective or the thing that you're trying to make change. You would say what the measure is, and then for some of the measures, at least, you're going to say what we know is happening right now, and then the target of what you want to have happen. And this really helps us hone our thinking around this idea of our objectives. Like, what do we really want to have happen with our action plan, with our logic model? And doing this, a lot of times when I do this for my own grants and things, I end up going back and revising the logic model because it helps me become more clear about what those objectives are. Are they measurable? What are my targets? So here's a series of questions for you. All right. First off, what in the world do you measure? So you definitely want to measure the outputs of your activities. So these are things like how many people came to the professional development. A lot of times grants and evaluations stop right there. They say, who came? How many people did I serve? How many children came to my class? And it's a really important measure, but it is definitely not enough to see educational change, right? Because just someone coming to your class or your professional development or whatever you're doing does not mean that they're changing their thinking. So you also almost always want to measure the objective. You always want to measure the objective, the kind of clear, narrow objective. You also will want to measure one or two intermediary goals or mechanisms, so the things that lead to your objective. And finally, the long-term goal in your logic model may not be appropriate to measure. You can measure it. Sometimes it's a little difficult, and especially for this project in terms of the timeline, it might be a little too difficult. And I'll give you an example here shortly. Okay, so here's my logic model, if you remember. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the measures for outputs, objective, etc. All right, and they're color-coded just for extra fun. So the outputs, you're measuring the outputs of activities. So in this case, who or how many came to the listening session? So that's this activity, right? I literally just go through my logic model. I want to figure out who came, right? Like that's an output. And then this clear, timely communication, I want to put a record of that communication. So like if clear, timely communication is my action item, I want a record of that. So outputs are usually pretty clear cut. They're just a recording of what happened. All right. Now my objective, this one right here, is fully accessible material. So that's really important that I measure that. And I'm going to talk about how I'm going to measure it in the next few slides. One or two intermediary goals or mechanisms. If you remember, my mechanisms are in blue. I've got a viable plan that I'd like to measure. I'm not going to measure the institutional understanding or institutional commitment because that's a little bit difficult to measure, but I am going to measure faculty commitment and faculty knowledge because here's the reasoning. I can measure fully accessible materials, and if it doesn't go up, if it doesn't become more accessible, then I'm not going to know why it didn't become more accessible unless I measure faculty commitment and faculty knowledge, right? So I want to see these intermediary pieces. Does faculty commitment go up if they attend the listening session? And does that lead to fully accessible materials? All right. And then finally, my long-term goal is that deaf students in my department will feel less marginalized. And I actually am going to measure that. But like I said, you do not have to. I'm being a little bit of an overachiever here. All right, the next question, how do you measure these things? So Randolph and Aronin have some advice. They say, measure the state of the objective before the program, that's a baseline, and the state of the objective after the program, that's the target. You do not have to do that for all the measures, just for key measures like the objective. And again, I will provide you an example. But without doing this, without doing a pre and post on your key measures, there's no way for you to know if anything has changed, right? So what if I measured accessible materials and it was like, yeah, 30% of course materials across the courses are accessible. I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, is that, I mean, it's obviously not good, but is it better than it was, right? Maybe the first measure, the pre-measure was only 10% was accessible. And the first round I got to 30%, I'm going to be pretty happy, right? And then I'm going to want to keep going. So you for the key measures, it's always really nice to do a pre and a post. So the next question is, well, what measures do you use? And again, I'll be giving you examples, but basically for outputs, a lot of times it's just record keeping. It's like sign-in sheets, marking things off a list, those kinds of things. For the objective and the goals and the mechanisms and even the long-term goals, here's a set of the kinds of things you can use to measure them. You can use an exit ticket, much like you might even use with a group of children. You can use a quick survey, like a 3-item or a 6-item survey. You don't really want to use long surveys or you're not going to get the data back. You can use a previously validated survey that you get from the literature. If you're measuring a particular construct like faculty commitment, you can create an open-ended survey. Just ask a couple of open-ended questions. You can use a short test, like so if you're looking at knowledge, sometimes a short test, and you can also use a set of short interviews. So these are just some ideas, and I'm going to give you some ways of doing that. All right, so just some things to consider in terms of measures to use. First of all, what is the measure actually measuring, right? So don't just take something from the literature and be like, okay, this says faculty commitment, when the questions don't really measure what you're hoping to understand, right? Carefully consider the questions and maybe even ask someone about them. Of course, I will also give you some help on that. Also, the closer the measure is to what it's measuring, the better. So for example, using a state exam, like a STAR test, to measure student understanding of a particular scientific concept, it doesn't work very well, right? I mean, this is so distal. The STAR test is so distal. It's like a cumulative knowledge of these students, plus a whole bunch of other things. Whereas if I use a formative assessment that the teacher's using, maybe like a quick quiz the teacher gives, it's much more likely to measure what I'm hoping to measure. So for example, I may not use the campus climate survey to understand the results of my project. I want something that's a little bit closer to what's going on. And as Hess argues, you may want to think about using less achievement data and more data about how the organization is working. So again, in schools, we tend to move towards achievement data. We want to be thinking about how do we collect data about how different pieces are working. Next, you want to ask questions about what elements of the plan are working best and what are not working. So a lot of times it's great to ask either a survey, open-ended question, or an interview question. Hey, what's still not working, or what challenges are you facing? And I love this quote, "Be smart and scrappy." This is Quinn, the director of Teach for America. This is quoted in Break, right? Be really sort of smart and scrappy about how you come up with measures that are very closely aligned with what you're trying to find out. Think about what it would be like to be the person doing the measure. Is it something that you'll actually give valid information? Make the measure short. We don't want 3-page long surveys. Those are great for research. But for doing iterative action cycles, you really want people to just do the measure. You want it to be short. You want it to be easy to process. And finally, collect more than one source of data to understand the whole picture. So like I was saying, collect data on your objective, on your mechanisms, etc.